Hello and welcome to The Pulse. Since January, educators from Hong Kong have been allowed to teach on the mainland if they pass teaching examinations and are willing to support the leadership of the Communist Party and its education policies. But it may not be teaching as they know it in Hong Kong. More on that in part 2. But first, this week, as world leaders assemble in Osaka for the G20 Summit, Hong Kong protesters are taking the opportunity to alert the world to what's happening here. On Wednesday, protesters went to petition some consulates from G20 nations. Also this week, a crowd-funded campaign raised more than $6 million in less than 12 hours to advertise in newspapers in Europe, Asia, Australia and North America. Beijing, however, insists it will not allow the G20 to discuss the Hong Kong issue. Meanwhile, in Hong Kong itself, questions over the policing of protests remain high on the agenda.
The police use of force against Hong Kong's extradition law protesters, particularly during clashes on the 12th of June, had deeply concerned many of the public and human rights organizations. After an offensive on the Legislative Council building, in which protesters has aggressively but briefly driven police back. The police struck back on the street. Protesters and sometimes non-protesters.
You shoot the journalists! You shoot the journalists!
Including media workers, faced an onslaught of police batons, pepper spray, tear gas, rubber bullets and beanbag rounds. On Friday 21st, and again this week, thousands of people, mostly young, have protested outside the police headquarters in Wan Chai. They want the government to set up an independent committee to investigate whether the police use of force was excessive. So far, 95 complaints have been filed to the Independent Police Complaints Council, or IPCC. On Thursday, Secretary for Security John Lee and Commissioner of the Police Stephen Leung met the press and urged the public not to lash out at the police in retaliation.
我哋必須明白，對政府任何地方嘅唔滿意，我希望大家唔好發泄喺警隊身上。
我亦都喺度借個機會呼籲社會人士唔好再針對我哋警察嘅同事。由於而家政治有啲紛爭，唔好讓呢個政治嘅仇恨放晒落我警隊嘅同事度。
Amnesty International believes the police use of force was excessive and had issued a report how not to police a protest, unlawful use of force by Hong Kong police. The organization has collected and examined online videos, verifying 20 of them relating to 14 incidents on the 12th of June. The report makes 7 recommendations, including asking the government to start an independent and prompt investigation into the police use of force and calling for it to ensure that police are aware that one of their duties is to facilitate and guarantee the right to peaceful assembly. On Friday, Amnesty International, Hong Kong Human Rights Monitor and Human Rights Watch issued a joint statement calling on the government to set up an independent commission to investigate the issue.
Well, with us in the studio are Roseann Rife, East Asia Director of Amnesty International, and Kenneth, Leung, legislator and former member of the Independent Police Complaints Council. Roseann Rife, can I turn to you first? I mean, your report, which we've just seen, highlights instances of police behaviour which is unacceptable by international standards. But can I ask you, compared with other jurisdictions, I mean, you cover the whole of East Asia, how bad is what happened on June the 12th here compared with other places?
Well, of course, Amnesty International doesn't like to compare one situation to another. We're holding all governments accountable to international standards, international law. So that's really what we're looking at.
I'm trying to get a sense of proportion, though.
I understand. I think that East Asia has some particular instances where protest is very common. and some, yes, can be very confrontational. We've looked at protests, for instance, in South Korea and Taiwan. But I think in general, more can be done in all of those jurisdictions to make sure the police are sticking to the United Nations standards on the use of force and firearms. And that's sort of what we keep pushing and encouraging the governments to do.
Now, you're calling for an independent investigation.
Yes.
What would that achieve?
I think that the mechanisms that are there now are not sufficient. On one hand, you have the police looking at its own behavior, and then you have another possibility that lacks teeth, if you will. I think an independent investigation should allow, for instance, witnesses to testify, should be able to compel witnesses, including victims, should be able to testify. It should be transparent. And should
it be wider, including the actions of the protesters as well?
I think all of that has to come out. I think it has to be investigated from all angles if you're going to have a truly independent, impartial investigation. But I think you have to make sure that the people who are carrying it out have the expertise. In this case, we should look into getting police experts, weapons experts, as well as international law experts. But it shouldn't involve people who are being looked at who took part in the events that happened on June 12th.
Well, let me ask you, Kenneth Leung. I mean, the government says we have, in Hong Kong, established mechanisms that work perfectly well. No need for an independent investigation. You yourself, until 3 years ago, were a member of the Independent Police Complaints Organisation. Is the government, do they have any kind of case on this?
Well, I think what the government was talking about is a complaint system, handling individual complaints about police. But here we are talking about a whole series of incidents, not just the 12 June protests and suppression, but also the marches, the rallies. And also it ended up with surrounding of the police headquarters. And how come all these series of events have not been tackled more wisely? Because some of the clashes could have been avoided if the government has put in the right, policy, or the police has been dealing with the mass more skillfully. I mean, I support the idea of an independent inquiry because the police complaint system is just handling complaints against an individual police, or even if you're talking about the senior management of the police, it's often escaped the liability because the complainant is often facing with a frontline officer, is a very junior police officer. So that is just part of the whole process of reconciliation. Although I admit that the complaint system here in Hong Kong has been working for many years, but I mean there are a lot of instances whereby complainants could not identify the identity of the policeman because you have received reports saying that police on the scene of the 12 June protest hasn't got an identification number at all, or on other cases, there may be just one against one evidence because the complainant is giving evidence against just one individual policeman, and because of no other collaborative evidence, many of these cases have to be dropped.
Well, as matters stand, the IPCC says it's going to conduct a study, not necessarily investigation into these matters. I mean, why won't that work?
Well, the study, so-called study initiated by the IPCC, I think the remit is quite restricted because they can only look at the procedure and practice of the police in order to reduce complaints against police. But what we want, I think the public wants, is a more comprehensive investigation into how these mass demonstration was caused, how it could be handled better. I mean, this more overview of the whole incident.
Let me ask you, I mean, do you think there is now in Hong Kong a structural problem with the police force? I mean, for many years, the police had very high regard in Hong Kong and was considered to be a model in some ways.
I think there are some problems, as you were talking about, the method, the way the police approach these protests. Our recommendations also include taking a look at that as a whole, that the police should be facilitating peaceful protests and not confronting it with this sort of overwhelming force, the numbers, the aggressive nature that can help escalate the violence. And I think we have seen that happening over the recent years.
You see, what the police unions and officials are saying is, well, you know, let's face it, on the ground they were provoked beyond reasonable levels.
But the police, let's not forget, the police in situations like this are the ones with the power. They're trained to deal with people who may become violent, and they should be dealing with those individuals separately. They should be able to separate those people who are violent from the vast majority of the peaceful protesters and not get them involved in this indiscriminate violence and use of crowd control devices.
I do agree with Roseann, because police, they are trained to tackle these protesters. They should get the adequate training and psychological, you know, preparation to deal with all the situations. And they should, you know, calm down the protesters, isolate out the most radical ones, subdue the people who use violence, and not just firing tear gas at a crowd. So we have to do a thorough investigation to see how, you know, we can help the police to build up their professionalism and image again.
That's all we have time for right now. We're going to be back after the break. We'll see you then. Thank you very much. Welcome back. The outline development plan for the Guangdong, Hong Kong, Macao Greater Bay Area was released in February. One of its proposals is to develop the area as an education and talent hub, including allowing teachers from Hong Kong and Macao to teach in Guangdong. A month earlier, China's Ministry of Education stated that residents of Hong Kong can apply to take the primary and secondary school teacher certification exams previously meant only for mainland Chinese. However, differences between educational models and pay in the two places are significant.
一会儿发电池。
Cheng Manchu was born in Hong Kong but moved to the mainland as a Form 3 student. 2 years ago, she founded a startup to introduce educational products there, including this technology program developed by the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology. She believes there are many opportunities for Hong Kong teachers if they choose to move.
香港嘅教育模式同埋內地嘅教育模式咧，都會有少少唔同嘅差異。咁我哋希望可以揾到一個平衡點，可以令到香港嘅教育模式順利咁樣落戶到內地嘅一個教育系統裏邊。如果你係一個研發出嚟嘅教育產品，咁內地嘅市場係非常之廣闊嘅，就係一個粵港澳大灣區都已經夠做晒嘅。你年薪過百萬係比較容易去做到咯。 如果你話你進入咗學校系統，擔任啲某啲職位，比如話好似我哋啱先呢個國際學校，咁你嘅薪酬水平嘅其實個升幅係非常之大。
However, Hong Kong educator Ego warns that there are challenges for Hong Kong educators.
譬如話喺香港係比較 free 一啲嘅，咁嚟到大陸、內地嚟到教書，可能佢哋就會着重多一啲關於教案啊，要個劇本可能都寫好晒嘅。
我看见这个有些闪动，这个完成了一个下载的一个功能。
對於香港嘅教師嚟講，可能個 challenge 喺個 language 方面咯，因為喺香港未必係一定要求佢哋講普通話，但係喺大陸，如果有一個教師證嘅話，可能佢哋需要去普通話一個基本嘅能力咯。
To get a teaching certificate, candidates have to reach Grade 2 Level B or above in the National Putonghua Proficiency Test, as well as passing a written test and an interview. Manchu failed to get the certificate on her first attempt. Her colleague Liao Xiaomei has taken the exams 3 times and now has certificates to teach in kindergarten and primary schools. She believes it can be very hard for Hong Kong teachers to pass the exams.
如果是准备笔试的话，可能就要看很多书，每一科的知识点都是很多的。因为内地每年有大概700-800万的人在报考这一个考试，它是全国统一考试，然后通过率应该只有30%左右，所以内地人考都很难。
We invited Leung, a liberal studies teacher who has taught in Hong Kong for 14 years, to attempt part of last year's paper. This comprehensive paper, compulsory for candidates, includes questions on principles of education, law and legislation, science, history, and art and culture.
有啲死記硬背嘅感覺嘅嘢咯，有好多條都係，同埋唔係我本科知識嘅嘢嚟㗎。譬如我教通識咁樣啦，我要考一啲物理嘅題目，你要有中國文化根底，又或者係即係喺中國社會裏面常討論嘅一啲文化元素嘅嘢咯，呢啲係。
Facing these less familiar topics, Leung got 40 points out of 58.
我最初以為係再低啲唔合格嘅，咁都 OK 啦，40分。
Good morning， 早上好，早上好。
During his career in Hong Kong, Alan Chan was the principal of several schools. Since taking early retirement, he's been running non-government schools in China since 2003. Now the chief principal of this school, he has long since adapted to the local educational model.
奏国歌，升国旗，少先队员行队礼。
因為國家規定咧，所有學校逢禮拜一係要需要升旗，所以一度都係一樣。我喺香港都係照升旗，但係當然冇而家升旗咁隆重啦，就唔會話唱國歌啊呢啲嘢。咁我諗呢一個就有少少唔一樣。
On the day of our interview, Principal Chan hosted an enrollment ceremony for the Chinese young pioneers. It's compulsory for students from primary 1 to 3 to join this political organization of the Communist Party of China.
恭喜你啦！立正啊！立得站好啊！即係國家領導人都希望黨喺細路仔心目中咧，好細個已經建立咗出嚟。咁一個係對佢嗰個管治啊，各方面我諗會有一個好好嘅發展咯。
Supporting the Communist Party of China, abiding by the constitution of the PRC and Chinese laws, and demonstrating resolve to follow the party's education policies are primary requirements for being a teacher in the mainland.
中国不断发展会怎么样？影响对，会对美国经济大国的地位怎么样？造成一定的影响。
During an education seminar in March this year, President Xi Jinping emphasized the importance of ideological and political lessons in schools. Teachers have to turn students into skilled workers who support the leadership of the party and socialism with Chinese characteristics.
了解自己國家嘅經濟狀況，或者外圍嘅政治問題，咁啊對佢嚟講嘅自己培養自己嘅國民嘅認同感係咪更加好呢？我覺得應該係正面嘅。
Alan Chan says that if Hong Kong educators want to teach in the mainland, they have to adjust their way of thinking and behavior and comply with the law and legislation here. That's why he avoids discussing sensitive political issues with his students and staff.
咁喺第一六四好耐啦，第二喺而家嘅青年生活中係冇呢樣嘢存在，咁你講嚟有意義喺邊度呢？ 我覺得政事需唔需要放喺基礎教育上面講咧？我覺得會有保留嘅。
你哋對六四嘅印象就係坐喺度嘅，咁點解咁多人坐埋一齊咧？我要認有件事發生，好激動係嘛？你要認啊！我越多人走晒出嚟，你就要認你殺咗人啦咁。好似先。 真係咁合理？我諗我哋科目裏面常希望帶動嘅係嗰種即係查根問底嘅諗法。咁至於政治立場，佢會自己判斷咯。佢咁細嘅年紀，我作為老師，我都去避忌，佢就會好驚啊。
Lo says she does not plan to take the teacher certification exam. She worries that if she taught in the mainland, she'd have to formulate teaching plans in group meetings with other teachers, and students would be unable to speak freely under the restrictive educational model.
要跟黨嘅話，跟社會主義嘅話，咁我就要 check 下佢裏邊有冇一啲嘢係唔講得喎。咁包括質疑政府嘅權威嗰啲唔講得嘅話，咁我啲咁剛才嘅課堂你咁質疑嘅嘢嘅話，我個質疑其實係帶動往後嘅後續思考啊嘛。如果我第一嚿質疑，即係第一個 step 都唔可以行，我後面嗰啲嘢跟住落就未必行得通噶咯喎。咁呢個都係我會好 concern 嘅地方喎。好坦白講，香港老師係好自由嘅，冇話一個特定嘅空間話，喂我一定要培養啲乜乜乜乜嘅人，又或者係我要喺某一個政治意識形態上面去培養佢出嚟嘅。香港社會裏面，香港老師冇唔慣做呢啲嘢，我哋係。